Amir, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thank God.
Yeah, indeed. It's a bit of an interesting time right now in Los Angeles, isn't it?
Man, I I tell my wife I'm kind of glued to the news cycle. There's a lot going on in LA, there's a lot going on in California, there's a lot going on across the country, and then outside the country in the world. It feels just like I don't know, and a lot of it I think is good, but a lot of it's also troubling and hard to watch and challenging. So
Yeah.
just a lot of news.
There is, and I unfortunately I kind of feel like I'm a little bit glued to the news cycle as well. I told myself this time around I wasn't going to wake up every morning and read what else has happened. Um, but it's interesting times right now that we're in, for sure. There is a lot of movement, and I agree with you, there's a lot of positive movement, but positive movement is not always easy.
No.
It's unsettling, and there's moments, like, we can talk about this later when you're setting goals for yourself and you wanna make something happen, and bringing things to light doesn't is not always a smooth path. And so, that's I try and I'm trying to give all of the history that we're experiencing right now a little bit of window before I jump into judgment, but boy, there's a lot going on right now.
I think it's true personally. Anytime you have a transition in your career or your personal life, a meaningful one, it can feel, the displacement and change can create anxiety and stress. Even though it's oftentimes positive, it's still hard. And I think it's true nationally. There's a lot that's been wrong. I think in our country, and um, you know, making the changes you need to make can really trouble people and create anxiety. And I think
Yeah, it's hard. It's not without its sacrifice and with its challenges. And we'll jump into that because there's a lot there's a lot to unpack on that stuff. So let's jump into a little bit of real estate stuff. So just very quick background. One of the things I was talking to my junior Cody, and I said, when I met Amir, we were looking at a we were looking at a 6 unit property on 21st Street. I don't know. Do you remember that deal?
I do.
I mean, I practically bought that deal, I loved that property, and we met there, and then we met at another one on 42nd, I think, down in South LA and whatnot, and then, but more recently, I've toured a site or 2 of yours that's in the development world, so I wanted to I wanted to kinda ask, how did you get into the whole development space?
So my background originally was I was an attorney. I practiced doing securities and M&A law. And in 2003, I decided to quit my law firm job to start a real estate business. I didn't want to be, you know, tracking and billing hours for the rest of my life, and thought real estate was a better business in general. And bought our first deal in 2005. It was a commercial retail development, and did a couple of those deals where we were basically buying old gas stations that had closed down because they were just in great locations. And I found that we were able to get good pricing because a lot of folks were scared to buy gas stations because of the potential environmental issues.
Right.
And I felt comfortable assessing that. So we did some of those deals, and then in when the downturn hit, we stopped to take a breath and kind of look at the new reality on the street.
It
Uh,
was 2008, so it was this Great Recession,
yeah, yeah. And banks were lending,
right?
we're getting foreclosed. Um, and what we started to do in 2010, 2011 was buy multifamily properties out of foreclosure auctions.
Uh-huh.
The first one was in Koreatown, just south of Wilshire, near Western. And then we bought a couple deals in West Adams. And we
Right.
this kept going further and further south because the prices dropped dramatically as you went further south, and the rents didn't drop in the same proportion. So before we knew it, we had bought a bunch of buildings in South LA, but it was wild. It was like you would get an address on Tuesday about something going on auction on Wednesday, and if you bid on it and won, you would be the new owner on Thursday. And you didn't know who the tenants were, you didn't know what the cash flow was, you didn't know what the inside of the units looked like.
How big were those buildings?
3, 4, 6, 10, 12 units.
Okay.
Not huge. And we did that for years, and we'd buy them, and then you'd go knock on the door and say, "Hey, I'm your new landlord."
Wow.
I had no idea what to expect. It was all cash. But that went well for us just because the pricing was so good. So as the economy started to get its legs back, we would stabilize those properties and refinance them and take our equity out, and we had these cash flowing properties. The business plan was always to buy and hold indefinitely. We don't have any outside investors, so there was never any pressure to sell and flip or anything like that. But that deal flow dried up as the economy continued to strengthen. And I think it was around 2015. By then, we had a nice little portfolio. We had a management team in place. And we weren't finding value in those rehab deals and existing buildings. So we decided to try our luck at building ground up. Yeah.
So this is like 2000, you said 15, 16?
Yeah.
Now, I want to back you up just a little bit. When you were buying, how did it work out? Ultimately, when you were buying those deals on the courthouse steps, this is almost more curiosity than anything. On average, what kind of multipliers were you buying at?
Well, we didn't know going into the deals what the multipliers were because we didn't know. You had no information about the tenants.
Right. So that's why I'm asking the question: is as fate has it, what was the outcome of that?
I don't know in terms of multipliers. The deals were generally very good just because we were buying units, Scott, at $30,000-$40,000 a door.
Ouch.
So it was hard to screw it up in terms of economics.
Right.
But that wasn't the whole story because the buildings were generally in pretty poor shape. There was a lot of deferred maintenance. I think we bought 4 or 5 buildings that were in REAP, which is the program that the city assesses for bad landlords, basically, that aren't maintaining their units.
Yeah.
And the philosophy was always to be a really responsible, good landlord. We always wanted to do right by our tenants, and I think we always have, or we try to for the most part. Sometimes you have tough situations, but yeah. So the model was we were very often able to refinance out 100% of our equity once we could stabilize those properties. So we were clearly adding a lot of value. We'd go in, we'd put more money in to clean up the units. Where there are vacancies, we were renting and getting them stable, even when, we weren't evicting folks or where there weren't vacancies. The general rents weren't terrible, and based on the low acquisition costs, it made sense, and we did very well.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You did that for a few years. Do you still own those assets, or did you?
Yeah. Never sold
Okay.
any of those properties. Those are all still in our portfolio.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. And then the first ground up deal we did was at the corner of 83rd and Figueroa. I think they call it Strawberry Lane down there because it's kind of the epicenter for prostitution in South Los Angeles. Yeah. That's strip on Figueroa. That's not why we bought it.
Right.
We just found empty land that was relatively inexpensive. And I remember when we went for a construction loan, the appraiser called me and said, "Amir, I'm excited about your project, but I don't know what to do." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, we don't have any comps. Nobody has built a market rate development here ground up the way you're doing it in 20 plus years. Are you sure you want to do this?
Uh,
And
yeah.
and I said,
What was
listen,
different then? What was different about the market rate projects you're doing? I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, please. I don't think there was anything different. We were just nobody was investing in South LA at the time, building ground up market rate projects. So there were, affordable projects that were completely funded with tax credits.
right.
I think that deal flow increased. It was sporadic back then, but it existed. But the appraiser couldn't find a single project in vicinity there where someone with their own money was willing to build a ground up project. It's high crime, it's low income. Nobody was doing it. And I remember, growing up in LA, I remember that the narrative was developers don't want to invest in South LA because these are Black neighborhoods. Right? It's kind of if there was a backbone to institutional racism or whatever the terms that are used, this was one of the things that reflected it was the lack of investment from developers.
Right.
And I mention it because kind of the irony is as we continued to do developments in these neighborhoods, the narrative changed and it became, white developers are gentrifying these neighborhoods, which was kind of the opposite. So it's like, if you don't invest, it's bad. But if you invest and build, it's not bad.
Yeah, it's really we could jump there. We could talk a long time about all that stuff, but I think it's fascinating that from your perspective, the way that you mention how, narratives operate, because I came to, Los Angeles in 2005.
Oh, okay.
And I'm from a country town, just about 3 hours north from San Ynez. And so we didn't really have multicultural. Our version of multicultural was there was a strong Latin contingent, in San Ynez because we were farms, but I didn't have any of this stuff. And it was interesting to me how entrenched a lot of the people's opinions in the investment community were about what you do, what you don't do, where you don't, who do you work with, who do you not work with. And I just, my orientation has always been pretty darn open. My parents were both school teachers. My mom was a kindergarten teacher. So I came to it very, naive, in many ways naive as to how people actually, made decisions, or put it that way, how they make the biases that it affected their decisions. So it's interesting that you came into it and you took those chances. You took a little bit of a risk.
Yeah.
And even in doing so, there's still, it's like we talked about that, I think off camera, that you don't, when you're starting out into trying to make change, you can't really control how people react to that change.
No.
Even if it's good, it's still change is hard, and it causes, not everyone's just going to line up behind you if you say, "Hey, I got this great idea. I want to help. Here I come."
And that really was the feeling. It felt like the best of both worlds.
Mhm.
We had a housing crisis that we felt like we could really put a dent in.
Yeah.
We figured out a way to do it without government money, using, our own assets and financing, all internal. We've never gotten money from the government to
Right.
pay for our buildings. We do receive subsidies through the rent assistance that a lot of our tenants get. And it was also, we felt like bringing higher density housing to neighborhoods that in South Los Angeles would help those communities, because a lot of the residents in these communities complain that there isn't enough retail, and density often is what will attract retailers. So we thought that we could provide a lot of benefits, but man, when you go to the community meetings, we would get a lot of blowback. People really felt concerned that you were going to build these projects and then only occupy them with white tenants, displacing folks from the neighborhood.
Right.
And to this day, I'd say, 80+% of our tenants are African American, and maybe 15% are Hispanic. And, there's another 5% that are other, being, white or Asian or whatever else. The vast majority are African American.
I would argue that, again, these are touchy subjects. I'm glad, man, willing to just sort of have them. It's tough, but I would argue that some level of gentrification is in fact the goal. Like you don't necessarily claim to want to control what happens or not, but in a free society, you want, generally speaking, if you have people that are living in a community that are more approaching the general demographic of a region, the more we have that, the more that some of these conversations become, I don't know, I think that they're more contextualized into reality. If you've got a community that's a little more mixed up in any given place, then you're going to get a better representation. And I think there's for all the negativity that gets surrounding the word gentrification, there's the flip side to it, is that you're bringing capital and you're bringing new levels of wealth, and everyone that's a property owner in that neighborhood, anytime that something is getting better, the property values are going up, and that should positively affect the property owning residents. And I certainly hope that includes, the population that is, sometimes claims a negative affect toward the gentrification. So, and
Well, I think there's some irony to that, because this has come up in some of the neighborhood meetings that we've presented our projects at. There's this feeling that, oh, you're going to build a new building and the rents in that building are going to increase generally the rents in the neighborhood. And I think the financial reality and the economic reality is, as you increase housing, you should be lowering rents, right? Supply and demand. I've literally had people at neighborhood meetings where we present our projects say out loud that that's false, and that's just something that developers say, and it's never been proven. But you look in cities like Austin and Nashville, Salt Lake City, where it's easier to increase housing stock just because the permitting process, entitlement process is a lot more streamlined. You don't have all the regulations that you have in California. As kind of, rents started to go up in those cities, developers were able to rush in and build lots of new housing, and that stabilized, and in some of these cities pushed rents down. And I think the thing that is frustrating in Los Angeles is they make it so dang hard and expensive to build that you don't get that same impact where you can really meaningfully increase the housing stock in a way that addresses the amount of demand you have for housing and brings housing costs down. And I think that we've done well. I'm not going to claim to be, out here purely to fix all of these societal issues. I mean, we're a for-profit company. We're not apologetic about it. And we build these apartment buildings because we're going to have some return on our investment and effort. But I do think that, if you could build more projects and housing units in Los Angeles efficiently, with less regulation, you would go a long way towards addressing the housing crisis we have in the city.
one of the things I was thinking about, and I think I riffed on it the other day, with a camera on, is in line with this. I agree with you very much so that the regulatory environment that I've sort of experienced in Los Angeles is they've created, if you're a market rate based housing developer, there's a bunch of different hoops that you can jump through to increase your density and reduce the parking and so on and so forth through the TOC, which I imagine you utilize the TOC incentives for free projects, right? Okay, so those TOC incentives, which for those of you that are not familiar, essentially it just means if you're, if you're developing a like a corner location that's in a busy thoroughfare, you're going to get these very large density incentives so that you can build higher and taller, and there's some reduced parking requirements so that the economics work out in exchange for a small percentage of affordable units. But post COVID, and again, you were doing this 2013, 16 and whatnot, but the time that's necessary to get a project entitled in California, in Los Angeles right now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what the feedback I'm getting is that it's almost impossible, but really the budgetary wise, you're looking at 4 years to get a meaningful project through entitlement and building and safety. And that's primarily because when you create a complicated method of entitlement for a market rate project, and then overlaid on top of that, because there's this now push for affordable housing, but it's not any kind of affordable housing. It's a sort of a mandated low income, type of, it's not a housing that is affordable, but it is, affordable housing, quote unquote. And this is, the city should be applauded for making this a streamlined process, but it's funny because now that there's this ED1 affordable housing, part of the requirement of the affordable housing of the ED1 program is that it goes to the top of the pile for a review and approval. And that has put the market rate projects into perpetual purgatory for review. And that's at least.
Yes and no. I think that overstates it a little bit based on my experience. I think the issue is it's very complicated.
Yeah.
You really have to understand the zoning rules. And they evolve. Like TOC stands for transit oriented communities, was this paradigm that was put in place not that long ago.
Right.
Frankly, nobody really uses it anymore because there's other programs now that provide better incentives, including new zoning rules that just came into play. I think it was February or March of this year.
Right.
It takes us, I would say, 12 to 18 months. We can get a market rate project entitled for the most part.
Well, that's actually that's encouraging a little bit.
But if the project has any issues that require DWP to do anything but a very simple, extension of power, it can easily roll into 4 years. Projects that are over 100 units is kind of the tipping point I'm finding, where you need a line extension from DWP, or you need to move a power pole, or you need to do anything that's kind of not cookie cutter.
Okay.
That's where you can have an extra 2 to 3 years of delay and huge amounts of extra expense. So originally, when we were doing our ground up deals, we were focusing on developments that were 30 to 80 units. That increased to like 50 to 100 units. And we started doing some bigger projects that we're trying to get entitled right now that are between 120 and up to 180 units.
Wow.
Those larger projects are stuck. Just, like it's been 2 years on a couple of those projects trying to get DWP to really confirm that they're comfortable with how it's laid out, that they can deliver power. And it's maddening. You can't get it. You can't get them to tell you, okay, this is your layout for your transformers is approved, and we are committing to provide power to your building on this schedule. It's like impossible. Much harder than getting planning approval or building and safety approval.
Why do you think that is? I mean, this is happening everywhere around the city. I've got listings that are missing power. Why is power such a huge issue right now?
I wish I could understand it. I will tell you that, first of all, it's incredibly difficult to figure out who to talk to like you do a submission and then you just wait and you don't really know who to call. There isn't like a human being that's easy to reach. And it feels like they just aren't answerable to anyone. Like, you know, we, what I learned was that the way to do it is to call your city council member's office and have them call DWP on your behalf when your projects are delayed, and then they'll get you a meeting. And we've been doing enough where we know who to call now because there's some high level folks that
Right.
are aware of us. But you know, if you're not an experienced developer that has the ear of the city council person's office or has a working relationship with managers at DWP, you're screwed. It's tough. Your projects will sit and then they'll sit and they'll keep sitting. And now with all the fires and all the focus that's been going on
Right.
Palisades and Eden, and you know, it's even worse. And I can't make heads or tails of it. I think that it's a cultural issue. I think DWP is not well run, and I'm probably sticking my foot in my mouth by saying this out loud.
Right.
I don't want to be targeted or anything, but you know, it really is unfortunate. And I think if the city is serious about getting housing built, they need to figure out how to really put some guardrails around how DWP reviews projects, provides feedback, and gets them done. And it's not only the time, like if you need a line extension, which means there isn't a power pole to feed your project, if they have to bring power from a different power pole, even if it's like a block or two away, the cost can be, you know, 7 figures.
Holy cow.
And, you know, the backlog of those projects can be a couple years. So even after they tell you, okay, we've reviewed everything, we've agreed on everything, we're going to give you power, we're going to give you the line extension, and that'll take you a couple of years to get to that point, Scott. Then they come and say, however, the line extension won't get done for 2 more years. So then you can't start building, because if you build and finish your project and they're not ready to give you power, you can't finish the inspections and get occupancy. So it's very frustrating.
So, you know, I'm as you're speaking, I'm trying to think and be as sort of non-judgmental and looking at the problem. And you know, so it feels like in the city of LA and LADWP, it does feel like I've experienced this too, where there's this sort of breakdown of that the ability for the human connection to help people solve problems. Where you used to be able to go and see the concierge in the building department, they point you in the right direction, and you could just show up and you wait in line, but then you could get answers to questions, and they're simple questions. And the last time I tried to do that, I had to book online, and they gave me the schedule, and then they sent me an email saying, we actually aren't having any appointments at that office at that time. So go back into the system and book it again. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. I spent an hour just getting that all figured out. And then they didn't have the wherewithal to just say, well, you've been rescheduled to this time or anything. It just was, no, just go do it again. And that's real. I think that's a sort of a symbol of what you're dealing with, sort of this breakdown in process that can be very simply handled with just humans talking to each other and have somebody that's being empowered to do that. And I'm not exactly sure how they get back to that. That's, you know, if you look at like, you know, Starbucks CEO is like reorganizing how Starbucks is doing business because they realized that they lost something during COVID, right? And I don't know how an agency is going to get ahead of itself that way without some type of leadership that says, "Oh, we have to kind of I mean, in a sense, Starbucks can threaten everyone's jobs a little bit, not being mean, but by saying our tone and our culture is now this way, and you have to kind of get on board if you're an employee." But I don't know if it's the same thing at a government agency. If there's any, you know, carrot that can be offered to help change a culture like that.
I think it's tricky. LA is a big city, and I know that the folks we generally work with at DWP are great. They want to be helpful. I think they're a little overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I think our grid probably, I'm sorry, one second. I'm on a call. I think our grid generally needs some upgrading. You know, there's just, it's like there's legacy issues and it's a little bit complicated, but at the end of the day, I think it's cultural, and I think they need more manpower, and they need to be really proactive, kind of neighborhood by neighborhood, assessing what the power needs are, and creating a more streamlined process. I mean, it's not like I'm trying to build a complicated AI data center. We're building apartments. Uh, um, it really does make it tough. I don't know. I don't know how we'll get there. But I think it's like a lot of things in this city, unfortunately, there just hasn't been the type of leadership that's been able to effectively improve some of the big issues, that the city faces. And it's frustrating.
Interesting. Um, you've talked a little bit about your projects. What would you do? I mean, one of the questions that I was sort of thinking about for you was, and we've identified a lot of these problems. So what would you do if we were to, if in a to incentivize builders to do what you're doing? So in essence, you're going in, you're using market rate strategies, and you're building housing in areas that are both benefiting by the housing need, and you're orienting yourself in a location that is affordable in its most basic nature. It's affordable because of its proximity and its location. So you're doing all the things. In many ways, you're a model of what the city, in theory, is looking for. Um, what would you do if you had the control to sort of wave your magic wand to incentivize more builders, not to get rid of your strategic advantage, but if we're just looking at it from the standpoint of trying to move Los Angeles forward, and do what we think is necessary, what would you do to incentivize more people to do what you're doing?
I think about this a lot because, we have problems building, we have problems managing our properties. And then I kind of look at the bigger picture, how the city's trying to deal with homelessness and other issues that we have. I think the strategy of subsidizing low income housing projects has been a pretty big failure. And not because we don't need that housing, but because the money coming in to subsidize and pay for the housing, it's coming in the wrong place and it's creating the wrong incentives. So when you pay people the costs of the housing, what happens is that they overspend. So I've seen low income housing projects that are funded through tax credits where they spend $900,000 per unit to build those projects. We build for a fraction of that. And it's not because we're cutting corners. It's not because we're building inadequate housing. It's because, there's a market and it's efficient. And when you go and give people money to pay their expenses with when they're building these structures, they end up overspending. There's a lot of cost associated with getting those tax credits approved. And the vendors that focus on those projects charge more for those projects than they do normal ones. Like if you go to an architect and they're going to charge me X dollars to design, a 100-unit apartment building, they'll charge you 3X if it's a low income tax credit 100-unit apartment building.
Yeah.
And it's true with the general contractors and the rest of them. So I think that we've wasted a lot of money doing that. billions of dollars.
Right.
And I think if you want to get housing built quickly, the way to do it is by subsidizing the tenant rents, because if there are tenants out there that are willing to pay a good rent and have government subsidies to pay those rents, which makes them reliable renters, and I'm basically describing the Section 8 housing program.
Right.
If you expand the Section 8 housing program so there's more of those tenants out there, people will go out and build apartments based on that need to fill the need. So one is reducing the regulations and costs associated with getting those buildings built. It's just kind of what we were talking about, where I think one of the big problems is DWP. There's other problems too, but so I think the biggest change that I would make is I would stop spending billions of dollars to, construct these projects that are costing $800,000-900,000 a door to build, and focus that money towards housing subsidies for low-income tenants that need them. And then you don't need to do these restricted units, because if somebody has a housing voucher, they can rent, a unit in any building. And you solve the problem by giving, those folks help to pay their rent. It's easier. You don't need the same amount of infrastructure. Things get built at a lower cost. They get built faster. And I think we would be in a better place if our city and state governments had focused the subsidy money on the subsidies and not the buildings.
You mentioned deregulation. So what on the deregulation side do you think, and does this, let's say, so on the deregulation side, what do you see as being an example of how to do that from a developing,
There's a couple things. First of all, it's so complicated that you just don't really, unless you've done it a bunch of times, it's very hard to figure out what you need to do to get permits to build in the city.
Right.
And I tell my partners that part of our intellectual property is the fact that we understand how to get through that process now.
100%.
It's like other people just can't do it. It's not even an issue of costs. They just don't know. It's frustrating. You go here and you get this approval, then you got to go there and get that approval. And it's tricky. So that's one. But two, every year or two, they update the rules, the building codes, to improve how environmentally friendly the buildings are.
Right.
And it sounds great, but honestly, it's like a lot of it is silly. So I'll give you a couple examples. They make you build where your roof has space to accommodate solar panels should you decide to add solar panels in the future.
Right.
They don't require you to put the solar panels, but they want to have space.
Laying the groundwork. Right. Okay.
This creates unnecessary costs. It becomes very hard to lay out your air conditioning units on the roof and then you have all this empty space that you can't utilize. So it's a real inefficiency. And
a high density building, the reality is the high density building, you're not gonna generate a lot of power. I mean, I help people with it. The only way you get high value in your solar EV stuff is you either have to build a different way, put the panels on the side or as eaves or whatever, or you have to build 2-story low density in order to get the power that way. So that
not only that, but there isn't a lot of incentive for the developer to put solar because tenants pay for their own electricity.
Right.
Generally. That's one. Second is they passed a rule where you're required to install sub-meters for water. And the thinking was if you have sub-meters, you're more likely to allocate the water costs to your tenants. And if you allocate the water costs to your tenants, they'll be more efficient about how they use the water.
And that there's some logic to that. Okay.
There's some logic, but if that's true, and if you're actually going to do that, the developer already has the incentive to do it anyways. The reality is before they were allocating based on this RUBS methods where they were prorating and allocating without sub meters. And the truth is, in a lot of these buildings, it just doesn't make sense to allocate those costs, especially when you have subsidized tenants. It doesn't really work out for us. We don't do it. But when you have to put the sub meters in, it changes your whole plumbing stack when you're building your building and makes it much more expensive than it needs to be.
Right.
So the upfront cost.
You can't just pump water to everything's got to be separated, and I'm imagining you probably have to recirculate every single unit.
That's fine.
That's yeah, and again, from an engineering standpoint, that's just insane compared to a centralized system.
Right. So the centralized system without sub-meters is a lot easier, less expensive.
A lot less expensive. And it's 100%. I bet it's 50% the cost.
I don't have an exact percentage, but it's an example of a well-meaning idea that was implemented, but the truth is it doesn't work. It doesn't help.
Supply and demand and simple economics solve this. All this stuff would work
100%.
out very quickly.
100%. Then they also added rules for trash. So it's not enough that you have normal trash. You need recycling, and now they added something where organic matter needs to be separated as well.
Mm-hmm.
So your operating costs have gone up significantly. And the truth is, if you research it, the entire recycling of waste has been a little bit of, excuse my French, it feels like, but a bullshit endeavor.
It's been a little bit of a farce when you dig into it. It's, again, on the surface of it all makes sense, but if the actual implementation of that system is not being seen through, then you're just sort of loading folks like yourself with this sort of burden so that everyone feels like they're getting things done, but they're not getting, the efficacy is not being translated on the other side.
That's right.
Yeah.
Then there's design requirements that they've created. So for example, in most of our neighborhoods, the new codes are that we need to have the first floor be at least 15 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
So to get 15 feet, first of all, it's very hard to do wood frame. It
Right.
becomes expensive structurally. And if it's concrete, that additional cost for raising your first floor is really meaningful.
Right.
They did not increase
The height.
the height. So when you increase the first floor, but not the whole building height, just all the other floors have lower ceilings. And so the units that people actually live in now, they have lower ceilings, and it's something at an increased cost. Well, no, it nets out right around 8 feet now, but it was, you were able
We're
to
getting 9
nice.
before. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're getting higher ceilings before at a lower cost, and they did this, and it's like, well, why did you do that? Well, I think the explanation was, buildings in West LA and in Beverly Hills, they generally are doing 15 feet because they're doing big lobbies, maybe they're
Right.
activating retail on their ground floor. In a lot of the neighborhoods where we're building, it doesn't make sense for us to put retail inside of the apartment buildings. There just isn't a lot of demand for it. So
It's not right now, but again, one could make the case that one could make the case. I can see the value of building, requiring the infrastructure to be to look like that. But the unintended consequences of losing a story or losing quality of life on that 1 foot, that's where it's it's not general enough. It's too specific.
Yeah.
Creates these distortions. So, all right. Okay. Interesting.
So these are the types of things they've done. It drives up costs. It doesn't have an immediate impact. It delays things. And, because the new rules keep coming, they keep coming.
Right.
So you got to really keep up. And even if
I mean, the plan checkers have to also.
Yeah.
Which means they have to take more time, and it has to go through the senior guy, and it has to go through 10,000 more layers because they gotta make sure that they're following all the laws that they're creating for themselves.
Yeah, businesses need consistency.
Yeah.
You need to stop making changes and just let people get used to the rules and build based on the rules, and you'll get a lot more efficiency, which is what we need to increase the housing stock.
So less rules. Less rules and just stick to it for a little while.
Stick to it for a little while.
Yeah.
Fix the DWP. Stop wasting money on the tax credit projects that are costing so much. I think those changes would go a long way, and none of them are super complicated. I mean, the less you do, I think, in your city government, your building codes, if you did less, you would get a better result.
You get a better result.
I think
So I've worked on some of these low income projects, and one of the ways that they get financed is through these these bonds that most of the time the banks are the ones that are financing the bonds because they have a mandate to invest in particular neighborhoods, and they have to either lend out dollars or they have to underwrite these bonds, and the bonds is one way that they make up the deficiency. Again, it's kind of it's an interesting system because it's deep into their whole FDIC mandate, and their charter is legislation that says, no, you have to do this. And so it's a little bit of a stick. The system is kind of built around a bunch of sticks and less on those carrots. But it's not, I mean, one can make the argument it's not necessarily costing, the general population money, although you could probably make the case that if they didn't have to make those investments per se, they might be able to offer lower interest rates to the general population because there's just not a way to justify that those are.
Well, I think there's two different things. One is banks are required to have a certain amount of investment in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah.
That are like CRA type neighborhoods. But separately is I think you're thinking about the tax credit financing that happens.
Correct.
And they're issuing tax credits to the developer for doing these projects. And then the bank gives you a loan. And once they receive, then they basically become a limited partner of your project. Mm-hmm. And what happens at the end is the tax credits get issued, you distribute the tax credits to the bank, and they forgive the loan that they gave you to build the project.
Got it.
So they're not required to do that, but they do it because the return they get on the loan is basically funded through the payment of the tax credits that come through the government.
Right.
But it's such a complicated process that you got to get lawyers up the wazoo to get those deals done. It creates lots of delay. And, all of that just adds to your development costs. And then the developers there do it because they get a developer's fee.
Right.
And the irony is the developer's fee is a percentage of the total costs.
No, that's it. It's not a profit thing. No, I mean, there's a case to be made that it's a profitable way of doing business, but, and I'm not, I think that there's a place for tax credits. It would be interesting to me to see how, a simplified financing vehicle could, so that somebody that like yourself that doesn't need to jump through 10,000 hoops could develop something that is in the direction of what the city's looking for and have access to what would be essentially like FHA style financing that's, insured and at a lower cost, or at least at a highly competitive cost rather than a higher cost, because due to some of the perceived risk or whatnot. How would you make Section 8 better? You mentioned, expanding it.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with Section 8 is they're not issuing any new vouchers. There's a huge wait list, and now, there's some indication that the HUD's budget is going to get cut meaningfully, and it's unclear. It's unclear how that'll play out. But I think the Section 8 program is great. We're big fans of that. They administer it well. They have I think, a good process where they come and inspect the units and come up with what they think is a fair market rental value, where they tell the landlords, and then you have the choice to accept or not. There's local programs that are funded through city and state dollars and through various nonprofits that broadly fall under what they call TLS. And I think it's some kind of, the T stands for temporary, but they're meant to work similarly. The problem with those, one, is they haven't had the same infrastructure that's been in place to support the Section 8 program. So it's hard, like you don't get payment on time, and it's kind of, each nonprofit that's administering that program is paying directly, and as opposed to going through the housing department that's got some around it.
I'm not
That's
familiar with that. That's
yeah. So a lot of that in the city of LA was funded through a group called LASA, which is the city agency that was.
yeah. So is this the sort of temporary, the housing assistance for like homeless, or?
Yes.
Okay.
And we do a lot of that work. There's a bunch of nonprofits and city agencies that are involved.
Right.
The whole program, though, is a little bit upside down right now because the county decided that LASA wasn't being managed properly.
Yeah.
There were some allegations of problems with the woman that was running LASA, and they've decided to set up a new county agency that's going to be administering funds for those programs. That's happening now.
Yeah, the meeting is actually today. Like it was actually, they had a closed board session meeting today talking about new management.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the old funds have kind of stopped, and the new program hasn't been put together yet. So we're waiting to see how that works out. But in the meantime, they hired a new entity to handle the payment processing for those programs. That's supposed to start July 1st. So just in a few weeks.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. It's some company I wasn't familiar with called Home, HOM. And starting July 1st, they're going to be making the payments for these TLS programs. So these are programs where the subsidy is administered through either HOPEX, there's Path,
Yeah.
Brilliant Corners. I think Brilliant Corners is county, so I don't know that they're switching to that. But then there's St. Joseph's,
Right.
Salvation Army, and a bunch of other nonprofits that receive these funds and pay them out in a manner that's supposed to work like Section 8. But unfortunately, there's no new funds, so there's no new tenants being placed pending this transition. And it's a little unclear how that all is going to turn.
I thought that those were, I thought those were those emergency vouchers. Is that the same thing as the emergency vouchers that were being issued for temporary housing or permanent supportive housing?
No. So EHV, Emergency Housing Vouchers, was a program where extra funding came in through HUD. And it was working just like Section 8, but they were new vouchers. I think 3,000 of them were issued in the city of LA. We got like, I think 100 of those in our portfolio.
Yeah.
And it works just like Section 8, except they issued new vouchers, which Section 8 hadn't been doing for many years.
Right.
The only place where new funds have come in for new vouchers that I'm aware of through the Section 8 program is through the HUD VASH, which is the VA funded for veterans.
Right.
And I think we're one of the leading providers of housing for veterans in the city right now.
Okay.
Which we're really proud of. We work closely with HUD VASH, and that's been great. Absolutely love putting veterans in our buildings. And they also, I don't think that their budget is getting cut or has been proposed to get cut. Whereas the Section 8 program, it looks like there are going to be some cuts, and we're waiting to see how that plays out.
Interesting.
Which is a shame.
Right. Let me ask a tough question before we wrap it up. But we're all
Sure.
should probably to play devil's advocate. Doesn't increasing Section 8 create inflationary pressure on housing prices for everybody?
I think it does. I think it does because it creates demand for housing for folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. But
Right.
the other side of that coin is, where are those people going to live if they don't get subsidies?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the opposite is also true. That for example, we were to remove the subsidy, I think the Trump administration had sort of thrown out the idea, like, why don't we just phase this thing out, make it like temporary? I mean, the same should be true. Is that if you look at, there's a population of Angelenos that if you remove that voucher, rents are going to go way down. There just won't, that population will not be able to support the rents that are being asked in most markets. And so you would find regionally, you'd see this reduction in asking rents, at least within the submarkets where they're most affected. But there has to be spillover, because at a certain point, anyone is what, that's how free markets work.
Right.
You know,
I think rents would go down, but you'd also get, like, we wouldn't develop new buildings.
exactly. People would stop building. So I think that's probably the fairest response is, in the short term, you have this drop, but in the long term, until there's an equilibrium of cost and return, you'll create that distortion will find its balance, with time.
Yeah, you can't build a new building in Los Angeles, in a neighborhood like South Los Angeles, and expect to get a return on your investment if you didn't have subsidized housing. Everybody would just build in West LA and in more affluent neighborhoods, is the reality.
So then what happens? Here's another question for you. So then what do you think happens if the city of Los Angeles were to deregulate um, the tenant protections on rent control? What happens in that environment?
Honestly, I think the impact would really be felt in the more affluent neighborhoods. I think the truth is, in neighborhoods like South LA, you don't have okay, I have a unit and I'm charging somebody $1,500 a month in rent. If I send them a notice and raise it to $3,000, guess what? They're just going to move, or I'll have to evict them.
Right.
There's no new tenant that's going to pay me $3,000 for that apartment in that neighborhood.
No.
So, and one of the benefits for the Section 8 program is, when you agree to take on a Section 8 tenant, you're also agreeing that any increase in rent is something that you have to get approval from the housing department. So every year when we want to raise rents on our Section 8 tenants, we have to apply to the city's housing office to get approval. We can't do it on our own.
You can't just do it.
So you kind of have like a built-in tenant protection for rent increases.
Right.
You're agreeing to take rental subsidies through these programs. So I think if you got rid of, the protections to rent control, it would really impact the A and B neighborhoods more than, the impact you'd see in neighborhoods like South Los Angeles. But yeah, in those neighborhoods, people would lose their housing because, there's folks that live in Santa Monica in rent control units that they've lived in for 30 years.
Right.
They might be paying $1,000 a month, and the
Without a doubt.
is $3,000 or $3,500 now.
Interesting. That's kind of, I hadn't ever thought about it that way. I do know that, like, Inglewood for the longest time didn't have rent control, and rents were stable. There was not the dynamic marketplace that there is in Los Angeles, where you have I've always made the case that, one of the problems with rent control is it really does create a dynamic of this cat and mouse, good guy, bad guy, landlord's bad, tenant good. And it's just not that it's not that straightforward. There's landlords that I've worked with are mom and like really kind of good people that are just, trying to make things happen. And the rent control creates a dynamic where a long-term tenant, just it typically becomes more problematic. And essentially the landlord ends up subsidizing the decisions that that tenant then makes for the outcome of it. Like I make the case for a number of years, then most people, if given enough runway, typically they solve their problems, right? If you need to make a certain amount of money, you're going to ask your boss for a raise. You're going to make maybe some life decisions that are necessary in order to continue to subsidize or to pay for your life. And if you don't, if rent control helps you solve that problem, you may not make some of the decisions that you needed to make in the first place.
Each person's life is unique, and it's hard to say exactly what led them to a point where they won't be able to afford, her apartment based on current market rents. I try not to make those judgments. I mean, we have units in our portfolio where we've had tenants that have lived there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years and are paying a really low rent. And you know what? It just is what it is. I think where it becomes hard for the landlords is your operating costs go up every year. They really do. Like insurance in Los Angeles and the whole state of California has gone through the roof. Not 10% or 20%, but 200 and 300% just in the last 18 months.
Right.
Interest rates have gone up. They've, effectively doubled over where they were 3 years ago.
It's crazy.
And all of that makes your carrying costs significantly higher, and rents haven't tracked to the higher costs. So there are some headwinds right now, I think, Scott, and I'm sure you see it too. And hopefully we get some relief on insurance. Hopefully rates come down a little bit, but it's a tough time right now. A lot of people have stopped projects because the numbers just aren't adding up.
So let's close up with that. So what do you think the solution is? Well, or is there a solution, or how's this thing going to play out? Because we're in a tough market right now. It's hard to find deals that pencil.
Yeah.
We haven't had time to talk about it. We've got into a bunch of great stuff, but I don't want to hold you here all day.
I hope that the state will engage with the big insurance companies that have pulled out of the state of California and allow a more dynamic market. I mean, I feel like what they've tried to do is protect people from the insurance companies, and everybody vilifies the insurance companies. But in response, the insurance companies have just stopped insuring in the state of California. And so now you get the only insurance companies that are willing to provide insurance at all are charging exorbitant rates. I mean, buildings that used to cost $25,000 a year to insure are at $125,000 a year now.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it's really, really meaningful.
We've been underwriting at 2.5x, but that's like 5x. That's incredible.
On some of my buildings, it's 5x. It really is. I think with interest rates, we got to get inflation down, and shame on the last several administrations for spending so much taxpayer money that we had these huge deficits that drove up insurance and inflation, and that's what's led to interest rates going up. I think they've released numbers today, and inflation was fairly tame, which is good news. Hopefully rates come down. I think those are the two biggest macro issues that would go a long way towards, creating some stability.
And both of those are kind of top down. I think the argument goes that those are both sort of top down, distortions in the market as a result of policy decisions that are not well rooted in the sort of long-term realities.
Yeah.
You can't force somebody to do something, and if you do, you create all kinds of problems. And then on the inflation thing, just not recognizing the fact of the matter that you really can't print money endlessly. It will, but the day will come. Closing thoughts. Do you have any questions for me?
No, this was really fun. I enjoy speaking with you. You obviously, you've got your thumb on the pulse of the market, and you've been great generally, Scott, to talk to about specific deals, and I think you do a great job. Um, I don't know. I talk to brokers all the time, so I do have a sense for where things are, and I think things are hard right now. Hopefully, we'll see some improvement coming.
I think so. I actually do feel like that we are turning a little bit of a corner, from a marketing standpoint, from, pricing and whatnot in the market as reaching uh, I think I think better times are ahead. It's been tough to pencil deals. It's been tough in the brokerage space. It's been tough as an owner, but I'm an optimist, so I do think things are moving better. Thank you for, it's great to learn a little bit more about how your orientation toward the market. I've been um, m- really inspired to work in the space that you're in a little bit, and I haven't forever. Most of my business has been in the West LA markets, but
Yeah.
it's really neat to spend time and effort working on sort of some of these big problems, that affect all of Los Angeles and are, national in scope, but just locally to be engaged in some of this stuff and addressing some of the homeless, issues and affordable housing and, kind of trying to move the world forward. I have found that that's been a great process. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, listen, we'll keep it going one of these days. Maybe we'll do a part two and get into some of these other issues. But Amir, thank you for your time. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott.
All right.
Like this.